Hello and welcome to the IT Pro Q&A. My name is Stephen Pritchard. Red Hat is the largest commercial distributor of open source software and the producer of the Linux operating system under its own brand, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is used by a growing number of corporates to run key infrastructure. The company now has a market capitalization of just short of $5.5 billion and has seen its business grow significantly during the downturn, even as companies were cutting their overall IT budgets. Joining me now to discuss some of the reasons why this has been the case and whether that growth is going to be sustainable in the medium to long term is the head of EMEA for Red Hat, Werner Knoblich. Mr. Knoblich, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. You're welcome.
In terms of the way that Red Hat's financial performance and sales has gone recently, you've done quite well out of the financial downturn. Why would you say that's been the case?
You know, whenever there's a disruption, people are open for change. Generically, people don't want to change because it's in the human nature. You know, change is always sometimes difficult. But through this economic downturn really caused a disruption and forced people to a change. So whenever there's now a forced change now in the IT sector, where now our message of delivering high-value solution for low cost just resonates very well, and we as Red Hat, our solutions are open source-based solutions, and open source-based solutions just help us to, open source helps us build better software faster at a lower cost, and that's exactly what now companies in the downturn economy are looking to.
Do you think, though, that the growth you've enjoyed in the last few quarters will be sustainable, or is it the case that as businesses have more revenues and more money to spend, they might look at more proprietary alternatives again, viewing open source perhaps as the low-cost option in hard times, but maybe not the best option in good times?
I'm absolutely convinced that we will sustain it because whenever customers start adopting open source technology, our clear experience is that they will actually increase the use of open source technology. When you go back in history, when Red Hat became big or became adopted in the enterprise, it was in the early 2000s when the internet bubble burst. And that's where then especially the investment banks on Wall Street started to adopt Linux in the data center. In the meantime, these are our largest customers with thousands of servers running our technology. So clear experience is whenever somebody starts using open source technology, they will increase the adoption.
So it's not in your view that they would then go back to proprietary Unix or to Microsoft?
Absolutely not. For sure, the downturn, as said before, the disruption helps the initial adoption because they are forced to do something else and look for alternatives which provide high value but for lower cost. But as soon as they have this experience, they stay with open source. There are multiple researches done by the analysts which clearly confirm the initial adoption of open source is mainly driven through cost, where cost is the main reason. But the additional adoption of open source is more driven through the other values of avoiding vendor lock-in, having a more flexible solution, having more standards-based solution, being more innovative, and so on.
What would you say the main advantages are of open source technology and, of course, your own Red Hat implementation of it in the current market?
It's not about open source or not open source. It's more customers are looking for solutions which are standards-based and especially don't lock in the customer. In open source based solutions addressing exactly these two problems. Customers are just sick of being locked into proprietary technology and cannot get out and are forced to pay relatively high maintenance or high license prices. So open source based solutions are just addressing this problem. It's not just about customers want to have open source based solution. They need a solution for their problem. And like I said, the problem is avoiding vendor lock-in and being standards-based, an open source solution addressing exactly these points.
So it's not a philosophical preference, it's a practical option?
Absolutely.
In the past, you've tended to win business, and the other open source Linux distributions have also tended to win business from proprietary Unix, so from AIX, HP UX, and so forth, rather than Microsoft Windows. Do you see that as continuing to be the trend in the future?
First of all, this is still one of our main part of our business is the Unix to Linux migration. There is still a huge install base of Unix out there in the market, which is to be replaced. And Linux is so much closer to Unix, as you know, means the migration cost for a customer is significantly lower on one side from the application perspective, because usually the applications running on a Unix platform run very easily or already certified also on a Linux platform, plus the migration from a skill set perspective is much, much easier. Having said this, we're seeing more and more also now customers moving away from a Microsoft environment as well, especially whenever there's now a compelling event on the Microsoft side with new versions on the market. Customers anyways need to upgrade, where they also ask themselves, are there alternatives? So we clearly see also now an increased business out of Microsoft replacements. Still, having said this, a big portion and the bread and butter business on the Linux side clearly is Unix to Linux migrations. But it's not just Linux. It is open source in general, also in the middleware space, where we see a fast acceleration, a fast adoption of our JBoss technologies.
And of course, you do have particular applications which run almost natively on Linux because they've already been developed for Unix environments, but you have others which are proprietary and much more tightly locked into Microsoft. And that raises the whole question of software. Is there sufficient software out there for people wanting to use open source, and in particular Red Hat Linux, to be able to run their business on that infrastructure without having to maintain two platforms?
I think this is one of Red Hat's strengths, because we have by far the largest, what we call, ecosystem. And the ecosystem here, especially around ISVs, so independent software vendors, and hardware manufacturers. From a hardware perspective, close to all hardware manufacturers, be it HP, be it IBM, be it Dell, and so on, Fujitsu, certify all of their hardware systems on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. In more and more ISVs, we have over 3,000 ISVs also certifying their applications on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So there's already a huge ecosystem. Having said this, still in specific vertical areas, or when you go in the very specific, SMB markets, where sometimes you maybe just find one solution for Linux and another 5 or 10 for Microsoft. So this is still an area where the ISV adoption is sometimes the hurdle to adopt open source technology. But when you look at the big picture, especially the horizontal solutions, when you go into databases, into middleware, document management, and so on, where all the major software providers certify their solutions on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And this keeps increasing.
Come back to the mid-sized business model in a minute, but just before we go on to that, one thing that definitely caused some concern in the marketplace was the acquisition of MySQL, which a lot of companies had used as the open source foundation for a whole manner of applications on the web and also on their own hardware. That was bought first by Sun, and then of course Sun has been bought by Oracle. There's some question marks about how well that is going to be supported, and also whether some of the open source companies that provide these key building blocks are actually quite vulnerable to being taken over by a vendor of proprietary technology. So perhaps a different example is where you've taken over JBoss. There's a natural fit because you're both open source. But where a non-open source company takes over an open source company, quite often what happens is that open source product is run down in favor of the proprietary product with all the maintenance and overheads that you've outlined already. How do you, as probably the predominant vendor of open source technologies in the marketplace right now, respond to that type of concern, that these technologies don't have the longevity that some of the proprietary technologies have?
You never know what happens in terms of who will acquire whom next. Clearly, when you look at the market, there's a big consolidation going on, and the big guys are actually getting bigger, and bigger. And this drives actually even more the need for alternatives, especially alternatives which are standards-based and don't lock you in. Out of this concern, which also customers have, is also the reason we are doing so well, because customers are looking for standards-based, open source-based solution which don't lock the customer in. And so I see there also a clear room for other companies, offering alternatives. And the beauty with open source is that if somebody acquires an open source company, if the technology is open source, the entry barrier now for somebody else taking this open source technology and building an alternative product, because there's a concern that the proprietary software company which acquired the open source technology is running down the product, as you said, is relatively low. So there is a good chance that somebody else will take the technology and come up with an alternative product.
So when you acquire an open source vendor, you don't acquire the actual source code, you acquire the rights to distribute that product in its current form and you acquire the rights to sell maintenance and other services around it, but the actual open source remains open source.
You acquire the knowledge mainly because you acquire the people who develop, a lot of the open source and technology. But you're right, you don't acquire intellectual property in terms of bits and bytes, because if it's under an open source license, it's open and everybody can use it.
Coming back to the point you raised about the mid-market, quite rightly, the mid-market is the area where Microsoft is probably the strongest. We are seeing some developments around cloud computing which offer alternatives. We have seen people within the open source community attempt to create alternatives to products such as SharePoint and Exchange, but the amount of penetration in the market has been quite low. Why do you think that is?
This is, first of all, the compelling event, or again, let's say the cost advantages in these areas are not as high as they have been traditionally on the Unix side when you look at Linux. Because with Unix, you went from a different hardware architecture to an x86 Intel-based architecture. In the Microsoft world, you're already on an Intel-based architecture where the cost advantages through this shift don't exist anymore. So this is for sure one of the reasons. The other reasons is that the ISV ecosystem is in this mid-size market space significantly bigger on the Microsoft side than it's on the on the larger enterprise. That probably is a second reason. But still, like I said, it starts to also creep in the mid-size market as well, because companies are just also sick of being locked in and looking for alternatives. Plus, you just mentioned cloud computing. These mid-sized companies for sure will think now twice or three times if they should further buy an additional server in the data center and another one, or potentially go to a public cloud provider and source some of the infrastructure from an Amazon, from an IBM, or whoever is a public cloud provider. And that's where we right now, as Red Hat, focus very much to ensure that these public cloud providers using our technology as the base infrastructure for running their clouds, where we just announced last week at our summit in Boston our new offerings in the cloud space with our edition 1 of our cloud foundations.
Aside from the cloud, how do you persuade more ISVs to produce Linux versions of their software, especially at the lower end of the market?
It's to a certain extent now market-driven. The good news is the chicken and the egg problem, which we had in the past, doesn't exist anymore because the market is asking for Linux alternatives. They're just specific segments. If maybe an ISV has a monopoly position where they are not forced to offer an alternative solution also on Linux. But in the meantime, the market clearly looks for the alternatives. And if an ISV is not offering his solution on Microsoft and also on Linux, they potentially have a competitive disadvantage. So that's the good news, that now the adoption in the ISV space is really accelerating on a daily basis. 5 years ago, it was very tough because the ISVs, they think twice and three times before they make the decision to introduce a new platform. But the market has decided Linux is mainstream, Linux is an alternative, Linux is established, and it will further grow. And when you look at IDC and Gartner and Forrester and whoever the analysts are at their numbers, everybody predicts Linux is the fastest growing operating system.
When it comes to the long-term cost of running IT, companies might save some money in the short term by switching to open source, but your competitors allege that the long-term total cost of ownership for Linux is higher than a lot of people expect. And the adage is that if your time has no value, then open source is effectively free. But as soon as you start paying for somebody's time, it can become as expensive as proprietary solutions. What are you doing as a company to reduce the total cost of ownership of running open source infrastructure?
I don't think that this statement you just made actually is true. I think the main thing is that we as an open source solution provider, as Red Hat, when we sell to a customer, the lock-in cost for the customer is extremely low. It means his exit costs are low, which means that we as a provider are forced to demonstrate to the customer on an ongoing basis that we are worth our money. Means we have to demonstrate that we provide value, that we really add value. Because if we don't, at the end of the term, they just will not renew our subscriptions, which they can easily do. So they don't renew the subscription, they're not paying us, but they can keep using the technology because it's open source based technology. So we are forced to constantly prove that we add value with our services so that the customers renew. And as long as we add value, then there is, overall, usually the total cost of ownership is significantly lower. Because in the license world, there is a lock-in, and the proprietary software companies can just afford to say, I'm increasing the maintenance by 10%, by 20%. I'm increasing my license prices by a certain percentage because there is a lock-in and the customer has no choice. Out of this, I'm convinced the total cost of ownerships will always be lower with open source technology compared to proprietary technology.
Werner Knoblich, thank you very much for speaking to IT Pro today.
You're welcome.